today, welcome. Here they come.
Morning, Katie.
Hi, Katie.
We're just doing introductions.
Oh, all right.
Perfect timing.
Good.
Katie, yeah, you have to introduce yourself right off the bat.
Have everybody done that? Katie
Yeah.
White. Katie White, Wilmette.
Another Wilmette.
And been on the trips before, love it. I'm excited.
Great.
I'm Fred White and married to her, and we went on the trip to Israel and Jordan.
Right.
And, back for one.
Okay, great. Great, well, welcome. So what we're going to try, you have the notes there that will follow on sort of the outline of what we want to do today. And the itinerary that we are taking to Greece and Turkey is best suited, and when you look at the New Testament books, to the Acts of the Apostles. So I'm going to be concentrating on that. When we go to Israel and Jordan, of course, the appropriate backdrop are the Gospels, which present, of course, the life of Jesus in that setting. But luckily, Luke, the evangelist, not only wrote a gospel, but he wrote the Acts of the Apostles, which describes this dynamic outbreak of the early Christian movement into Turkey and then into Greece. And so it's perfect for us, just in the sense of our interest in this trip. I think has multiple interests. These are wonderful countries. I think especially Turkey is something of a sleeper for people unless you have been there, but it's a very dynamic, beautiful country. And of course, Greece is sun-washed and beautiful. They're having their troubles economically, obviously, but it's beautiful. And early Christianity just flourished in both these places. So we're going to see a lot of history. We'll absorb the beauty and enjoy the current situations and people in those places. But part of the intent of this trip is to try to make a connection to the biblical backdrop of it. So we're going to look at what is the most appropriate biblical book. But in fact, there are a number of New Testament books that are associated with the regions that we'll be visiting, particularly the city of Antioch, which most travelers to Turkey don't go to what's called Antakya today, Antioch, which is down right near the border with Syria and not so far from Lebanon. It's in the southeastern part of Turkey. But Antioch, as we'll point out, after Jerusalem, was probably the most important city for the whole development of early Christianity. And it's a very interesting city today. It's a small, about 300,000 people, 99.9% Muslim with a little tiny Christian community, but a vibrant one that we'll visit when we're there. And it still has the kind of spice, I guess you would say, that it was noted for in the first century. It was the third largest city in the Roman Empire. And it's sort of located on the spice route, coming from Asia and moving over towards the west to Macedonia and Rome. And even today, Antioch's cuisine and the flavor of the city still retains some of that heritage. So happens the guide that we will have, whom I've worked with for many years, his name is Elsie, Ahmed Elsie. He is from Antioch, and he takes great pride in it. So we will be prowling through the old market, and he'll have the different people have us test some of the delicacies and spices when we get there. This is not part of the biblical exploration, but part of the modern exploration. So anyway, we're going to be viewing these great lands, and as I say, through the lens of of the Acts of the Apostles. I have some maps here, and the Roman Empire. This is a map taken for covering probably one of the largest extents of the Roman Empire. So it probably would have been, this is 3rd or 4th century, but it's a good map to cover what we're going to be looking at. Of course, here is Judea, the place where it started. And then Antioch is like right here. Later you'll see we have some maps with the names on it. And then from here to the west is where the missionary journeys of Paul and the early Christians moved out. Also a very significant place that we'll see in Acts is a harbor city, Caesarea Maritima. Some of you that visited Israel and Jordan know what a spectacular sight that is. But that was the major harbor, and this is where Paul and his final journey, as mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles, made his way ultimately to Malta and then Puteoli to Naples and to Rome. Our trip, just for a moment to relate it to our itinerary, we sort of go backwards. Okay? You can't exactly follow Paul's steps. There's some practicalities. But of course, we're going to be landing in what was called in the Acts Macedonia. Philip of Macedonia, we think of. That was the region at this time. And we will be in Thessaloniki, which is a major city right here, the second largest city in Greece. And we from there will go further to the east to visit Philippi and Neapolis, the first places where Paul landed. We'll see this in Acts, how significant this was, his move from Asia Minor to Europe. And then we'll go from there. We drive by a beautiful bus coach. We visit Berea. We visit Virgina, where is a spectacular site of the burial of Philip of Macedonia, the father of Alexander, that was discovered just a few years ago. It's incredible. This tomb intact, this burial under a burial mound, and all of the things found in it. And then we travel down through what was ancient Macedonia, and we sort of go off of the biblical beam and go to a place, Kalambaka, where there is this area called Meteora, which is an incredible Orthodox monastery. It's built up on the cliffs. It's fantastic, really, to visit, which we will. We spend the night there. And then we come down to Achaia, to the section of ancient Greece where we visit Corinth, Cenchreae, and Athens, as Paul did. Paul himself, when we leave the north here and we're moving south, according to Acts, we're following Paul. He left from Berea. He was tracked from Philippi to Thessaloniki, and opposition kept building to him, as we'll see in Acts. And so then he moves down to Athens and finally to Corinth, which is on the southern Peloponnesus. A very important part of sort of the central section of the Acts of the Apostles, where Paul is. From Athens, we fly to Turkey and Kusadasi, which is a port city, a modern port city, and from there we visit Ephesus, which also figures very strongly in the Acts of the Apostles, which was a major Roman city, a very cultured city that has, as you know, these spectacular remains. Ephesus is one of the most beautiful remains of a Roman city, still extant, and we will explore that. And then from Ephesus, we fly sort of by way of Istanbul. You have to change planes in Istanbul, and we come to Antioch down here. and we'll spend a couple days in Antioch, and that is so important, as I said, for early Christianity, and it's so interesting a place, really. And then from there, from Antioch, we will drive to Cappadocia. Cappadocia is noted now and visited by many people because of its very unusual and interesting and fascinating terrain with this erosions that have taken place. It looks like the surface of the moon, I guess. I haven't been to the moon, but if it would be, it'd be like that. But Cappadocia is also mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles. People from Cappadocia visited Jerusalem at the Pentecost story. And the early Christianity, we'll see remains of early Christianity in Cappadocia for sure. From Cappadocia, we fly to Istanbul, which of course is not on this map. It wasn't existing. Constantinople would be there. And we visit that beautiful international city. Some of you may have been there, and complete our tour there. So what we're doing, we're going to be hitting some of the main sites. We'll go to Tarsus. I didn't mention, see Cilicia there. Tarsus is in the province of Cilicia where Paul was born, and he was very proud of that. He mentions it in Acts. So on our way from Antioch, we go to Cilicia and then up to Cappadocia. So we will have covered not every place, obviously, that Paul traveled. They estimate some 10,000 miles during his few years of his ministry. It's incredible. Most of it on foot. So we won't match Paul. Some of us have knees we have to be careful about, but we will cover a lot of ground. And the backdrop, as I say to this, is the Acts of the Apostles. But other writings that are connected with this, and I'll be mentioning them along the way, the Gospel of Matthew, almost everyone believes it was composed in Antioch. Okay? There's a lot of memories of Peter in Antioch. Paul confirms in the letter to the Galatians that Peter was there in Antioch. And remember, they had an altercation because Peter withdrew from table fellowship with Gentiles, and Paul says, I withstood him to his face, you know. And we know from the early chapters of Acts, the Jerusalem Christians were very interested in and concerned about what was going on in Antioch, because that's where large numbers of Greeks, of Gentiles, were being brought into the community. It's where the Christian movement was first called Christian, as we'll see in Acts. So Peter is associated with that area. Also in Ephesus, the name of John, the evangelist, is very strongly memorable. We'll visit the remains of an enormous Byzantine church dedicated to John. Several of the early councils were held there at Ephesus. And there's a strong tradition, not really provable, but a strong tradition that at some stage, John and some of his community left Judea and moved to Ephesus. There's also the association that the mother of Jesus, Mare, lived for a time in Ephesus. There is a modern shrine there, the House of Mare, up in the hills above Ephesus, that we will probably visit. But this is not a historic site. This was what was the name of the German sister, medieval sister, had a vision that the House of Mare was at this site. And anyway, we'll see. It's an interesting place because it is also a very well-visited Muslim shrine. The Muslims reverence the mother of Jesus. In fact, there's more references to Mary in the Quran than there is in the New Testament. So you'll see a lot of Muslims visiting this shrine of Mary. Also associated with the region, we're in particularly the western part of Asia Minor, is the book of Revelation. Wrote to the churches, the 7 churches in that area. Also, finally, mentioning Peter, there's the first letter of Peter, which was written from Rome, which we're not visiting on this one, but addresses a whole series of churches in sort of a circuit in Asia Minor. It was written to Christians in Asia Minor. So we'll think about that. There's a very sharp contrast between the perspective of the first letter of Peter and the book of Revelation. The first letter of Peter has a very graceful sort of witness theology. It's the famous text in First Peter is always be prepared to give a witness to the reasons for the hope that you have, but do it with gentleness and respect. It's a very beautiful quotation. The book of Revelation, on the other hand, is pretty vigorous. You know, you're neither hot nor cold, so I'll spit you out of my mouth. No compromise. The Roman Empire is demonic. Don't bother with witness except a witness of total separation, total non-compliance, total non-compromise. So two very different stances from two early Christian writings that we'll think about when we're there. And the reason the book of Revelation is so deadly about Rome is mainly its economic exploitations. That there were great bread famine and so on in the western part of Asia Minor during that period, and you'll find, and we'll read some of the passages, the juicy passages in the book of Revelation about the economic oppression created by the Roman Empire, which leads the author, among other things, to see it as demonic, as utterly destructive, and not to be compromised with in any way whatsoever. So it's interesting, you know, thinking of the different witnesses that we have. So there's a lot of New Testament here. The way we do it, by the way, on the trip, we have to have state guides, state license guides in Greece and Turkey. But fortunately, the two guides we have, Aliki Pelteki in Greece and Ahmed Elsi in Turkey, I've had the chance of working with them for years. And they're good friends. They're excellent guides. But we sort of, you know, pair off on the biblical things, and then, you know, they talk about the contemporary things and so on. So it's a very nice, easy partnership, and both of them are very solicitous, very helpful for anything we need. And so I think you'll come to enjoy them. Okay, are we ready to make the plunge into the Acts of the Apostles here? And anywhere along the line, if you have questions or anything, observations, please feel free to to raise your hand, speak up, and we'll take some breaks along the way too. And as Anne-Marie mentioned, we have lunch at 12:15, but we'll have some breaks before we get there, a chance for coffee, and feel free to get coffee or whatever when we're going. But if you look back at the notes that you have, let's turn now to the sort of the ancient side of this, the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles. I put there from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. The geography is a very important organizing principle for Luke, as we'll see. Certainly true for the Acts of the Apostles. And just to remember, of course, the writer, Luke, in writing this second volume, as with the first volume, his Gospel, that his purpose, he's not trying to be a historian as such. Okay? So in other words, he's using historical traditions, but this is really preaching, I guess you would say. It's exhortation. We'll see that in a moment in the prologue that Luke gives to all of this. So he's telling the story of the spread of the gospel for purposes of inspiration, for purposes to move his readers, to see the continuity, to see the dynamism of the early Christian movement. There's a lot of discussion in biblical scholarship about the historical accuracy of the Acts of the Apostles. And because Luke is editing, Luke is trying to tell, as he calls it, an orderly story. He highlights continuity. And if you read Paul's letters, there's probably more discontinuity than Luke lets on. You know how you have different people. Some can tell how this organization got started, and they're sort of the propagandists, That's what you have to do as president of CTU. I have to tell you all the good things, And Luke is that way. Luke is trying to show that that God's plan sort of unfolds in this beauty. There's troubles along the way, but the troubles are always surmounted. And it's sort of inexorable, the movement of the Spirit bringing the gospel from Jerusalem, as he says, to Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. We'll look at that on a map in a moment. But he's utilizing at the same time some really obviously historical information. The people who study the New Testament say, if you want to, you've got to read with like two eyes. You keep one eye on the letters of Paul, and you keep the other on the Acts of the Apostles. And sometimes it's a little hard to, reconcile the two. Paul's writing letters, and Paul is a first-hand witness to experiences he is having. So most of the time people want to say, let's go with Paul if there's some disparity. Luke, on the other hand, is writing from 30,000 feet up. And he's showing the continuity. He talks about Paul a lot. At some points in the story, it switches from third person to first person plural. It's called the we passages. And people speculate that for a time Luke was actually traveling with Paul and was experiencing these firsthand. Others say, no, it's just a device. It's a literary device. But I tend to think that Luke at different times was really closely associated with the events that are being told. So I put there, the Acts of the Apostles is a story, not in the sense that it's fictional, but that Luke is telling the story in a way that highlights continuity. It highlights the dynamism of the Spirit of God that's moving. It highlights great characters. There's so many people in Acts, every place you go, there's... one time at a class I had, I should pull out those notes, I just listed the names that appear in the Acts of the Apostles. Like throwaways, they have one cameo appearance, but there they are, they're just mentioned by the way as they're going along, and I think that's interesting. There's a great historian of early Christianity, Martin Hengel, just passed away about a year or so ago, a German scholar. And he wrote a little book called The Charismatic Leader and His Followers. And he was using like sociological categories to try to understand early Christianity. And he says, the spread of Christianity was not so much or simply the triumph of a great idea, but was fueled by the witness of great people. And Acts sort of confirms that. I mean, there's these great people in each place, Lydia and Cornelius and, Paul, of course, and Peter, but a lot of cameo people that appear in Acts that carry it along. And then finally, as I put there, as already said, the crucial role of Turkey and Greece in the spread of early Christianity. I first visited Turkey back as a graduate student studying in Europe. And when I went there, it was part of a program that the University of Louvain had. I had never realized the role that Turkey played and the amount of remains of Roman cities. I mean, it's a very important, very important center for the Roman Empire, and also, therefore, for early Christianity and for Judaism. There were many Jewish settlements and collections of people. We see in Acts where Luke describes the people coming to Jerusalem for the Jewish festival of Pentecost. And he mentions all these cities, mainly in Asia Minor, that they are coming to the festival. So that's just a little preliminary, and I put there the structure of Luke Acts. I don't know if most of you would not have your New Testament. You don't get any penalization because of that. Besides the fact that you're on camera, I don't want to embarrass you, but Luke, has a prologue. He's the only gospel writer to begin his story with a formal prologue, a dedication, if you like. And this is what he says. Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. And Theophilus, which in Greek means beloved by God, we don't know if he's a real person, an early Christian that Luke is sort of dedicating this to, perhaps the patron that was helping finance this writing and production, or as sometimes happened in these kind of prologues in Hellenistic literature, sort of a fictional reader, sort of dedicated to you, my reader, Theophilus. In any case, he writes an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. And the term truth here in the Greek is not like truth in the sense of true or false, but it's almost like assurance, okay? The confidence in. You can count on what's being said. Truth in that sense, that you can know that this is really foundational for you. So he writes this prologue. This is at the beginning of the gospel. And so he wants to show everything from the beginning, and he speaks about the fact that others, some eyewitnesses and bearers of the word or servants of the word, and people interpreting this, see, that's like two generations. Okay? So there's the first generation, the eyewitnesses, and then there were the people who were the preachers, who were the traveling missionaries that moved around and told the stories of Jesus and so on. And Luke is sort of at the end of that line. Okay, so there's the eyewitnesses. He doesn't claim to be an eyewitness. He's not one of the apostles. He's, aware of the fact that there were eyewitnesses in the community. And then there were the bearers of the word, people that were teachers and preachers, and then him. And he's going to write this orderly account. And the orderly account, shows in the first volume the gospel, which for Luke begins in Jerusalem. Okay? Luke really wants to show the taproot of Jesus and his mission is in Judaism. And so if you remember in Luke's infancy narrative, the characters are these great Jewish characters. Zachary and Elizabeth, Anna and Joachim, the shepherds. It's Mary and Joseph, of course. These are like the pious ones associated with the Temple of Jerusalem, but they're filled with the Spirit. They are, singing canticles. They're just ideal, and it's out of this rich brew that Jesus emerges. Okay? And so unlike Matthew and Mark, who begin like in the desert or begin at the Jordan, Luke begins in Jerusalem. And it's from Jerusalem that Jesus, the young Jesus, goes to Galilee with his family. But you remember, when he goes back at his bar mitzvah, he doesn't want to leave. Remember, they get separated, the story of the family traveling, and they're separated. And I must be in my Father's house. There's this deep love on the part of the Lucan Jesus for Jerusalem and the temple and this epicenter of Jewish piety and teaching. And then you have the gospel, which begins in Nazareth of Galilee, Jesus preaching in the synagogue there. And Luke is the one who casts the story, and I'm just giving the bold strokes here so we can focus on Acts. He gives the bold strokes of the whole life of Jesus from his Galilean ministry becomes a journey to Jerusalem. Okay. He's noted for casting the whole mission of Jesus as the single fateful journey to Jerusalem. And when Jesus comes into Jerusalem, only in Luke's gospel, Luke describes, his coming up Bethany, Bethpage, over the crest of the Mount of Olives, and there before him is Jerusalem and the Herodian temple. Still a great sight. Those of you who've been there, a great sight to observe. And Luke has Jesus burst into tears. He weeps over the city, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I would have longed to care for you like a hen cares for its brood, but you would not. And so Jesus has this great love for Jerusalem, and it's in Jerusalem that he experiences both a crucifixion but resurrection. And Luke has all of the appearances of Jesus, unlike in Mark's gospel or Matthew's gospel or John's gospel, where appearances take place in Galilee. He has the resurrection appearances in Jerusalem. And the only exception was the two disciples that try to get away for the road to Emmaus, you remember, and Jesus walks with them, and they're all discouraged and they're leaving, and after the appearance of Jesus to them, they turn around and go back to Jerusalem. Okay. And the word at the end of the gospel, the word that Jesus says to them is, stay here in Jerusalem until you receive the Spirit from on high. So he really sees the life of Jesus goes from Jerusalem to Jerusalem. Okay? And what he's emphasizing here, for the sake of Theophilus, is to say the roots of the Christian movement, the spirit of the Christian movement, is thoroughly embedded in Judaism. Okay? And that is the anchor, and that is the point of reference. And the point of reference in the whole story of Acts is towards Jerusalem. Okay? Only at the very end does Paul get to Rome, okay? And in a way he did not expect. He gets there in a prison ship, as we'll see the final chapters of Acts. So for Luke, Jerusalem is so important. It's an ambivalent city. It's the city of beauty. It's the city where God dwells. It's the city of the prophets. It's also the city that kills the prophets, the city that rejects Jesus, and so on and so forth. But it's very important to him. And we'll see, that Paul in Acts, the reference point is always back to Jerusalem. He wants to take the collection to Jerusalem. He wants to, return to Jerusalem. And he does faithfully in the story of Acts. So the end of the gospel, I put there chapter 24 and Acts 1, is sort of, the story begins in Jerusalem, the community waiting there, the risen Christ ascends, and the Spirit comes. There's this explosion of the Spirit, as we'll see in Acts. Now, I'm going to skip over this next point a little bit. There's a lot of parallels. We'll see this be one of the things that's clear if you were to read right through the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, you would see that Luke has a lot of parallels between the two. what happens to Jesus happens to the community in Acts. Okay? And that's very deliberate. He's trying to say, in a sense, that the Spirit of Jesus, the Spirit of God that animates the early community, makes it like Jesus. Okay? And so just as Jesus began his mission in Nazareth with the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, Sonny and Luke quotes that famous passage. Pentecost, the storm of the Spirit begins the Christian movement. When you have the first martyr, Stephen, he says the same thing Jesus says, Father, forgive them, they do not know what they are doing. You have the same kind of spirit of, and you have this journey now, just as Jesus' life was a journey to Jerusalem and ultimately a journey to God through the ascension, so the Acts of the Apostles is the life of the community is a journey. In fact, Luke tells us that the first name given to the Christian movement was the people of the journey. Before they were called Christians, that was the self-designation of the Christians, the people of the way, the people of the journey. It was a very important metaphor for them to understand. They were on the way ultimately to God, but they're a moving, dynamic process. They're not inert, and for Luke, they're expanding out from the center in Jerusalem to envelop the Gentile world. So a lot of parallels that we'll see. And finally, by way of introduction, and we'll take our breath here. So just as I said, the gospel moves from Jerusalem, Galilee, Judea, Jerusalem again. Okay. So in Acts, it has this phrase that occurs a couple of times. You will go from Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. Okay. So that Luke sees this expanding dynamic view of the gospel. It starts at Jerusalem and it goes through, sweeps through the lands of Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. Okay, Rome is the ends of the earth. Okay, finally, in a way unexpected, the gospel will get to Rome in the person of Paul at the very end of the story. Now, if you were to look at how, in fact, the chapters of Acts that we're going to go through, I hope it won't be tedious, but just to look, and we'll track it on the map, see where we're going to overlap with some of this. It's sort of Jerusalem, Judea, Antioch, Asia Minor, Macedonia, Rome. Okay, that's the way the gospel, the Acts of the Apostles. So it starts here, it moves to Antioch. The missionary journeys of Paul, first with Barnabas and then with Silas, move through Asia Minor. Then in a dramatic moment, here's a dream about a Macedonian asking him to come over. He goes to Greece. He goes through Greece. Of course, Paul comes back ultimately to Jerusalem, bringing the collection. It was very important for him from the various churches out of homage to Jerusalem. And then he's arrested. He spends 2 years in Caesarea Maritima with the Roman governor sort of dithering about his trial. And Paul appeals to Caesar as a Roman citizen, and he finally makes the trip to Italy, coming ashore at Puteoli, the port city of Naples, and then to Rome. And in the very end, sort of laconically, he said, and so we came to Rome. Yes, did you? Yes, please, John.
During the apostolic times of the church, while they acknowledge that the Judaism is their root,
Yes.
it's kind of intriguing to me that for the first, let's say Paul wrote his first letters in 50, so
Right.
the 20 or 30 years after Jesus died, everything is by witness, everything is by word of mouth, everything is by preaching.
Right.
I've always been kind of intrigued that from the gospel, from the Acts of the Apostles, there, thousands of people are converted because Peter's speaking or something like that. Was the message of the Jewish religion kind of in turmoil at that time, so that, let's say, the hunger of the people when Peter and Paul preach, it's, they said that's the
The
message
response,
for
you
us.
mean, yeah.
In other words, I'm not denying the Holy Spirit was certainly working during
Right,
that
but
time.
what was it that
But what
captured?
was the cultural struggles that
Yeah.
people kind of said, the Jewish message is not for me anymore, now Christ's message is for me?
Well, it's very interesting question, and one of the things that we have to think about to get back into the mentality of the time, that probably for a Jewish person who was moved by what Paul or Peter were saying, did not think that they were leaving their Judaism and becoming Christians. Okay? In other words, the presentation, and this I think was true for Paul all the way through, never felt he was leaving his Judaism, but finding its fulfillment, if you like. Okay? That this was a transformation. There's a lot of discussion in interpreting Paul's letters. What is the term to use? Conversion or call? In the Acts of the Apostles, of course, we have the dramatic story of Paul on the way to Damascus, and he's knocked to the ground and blinded, and that's from 180 degrees, right? From the persecutor of the church to the now exponent of proclaimer of the gospel. So that looks like a conversion, turning. When Paul in Galatians, in the letter to the Galatians, the opening chapter, speaks on his own terms about what happened to him, he doesn't speak that way. He speaks in the terms of the call. He cites from Isaiah chapter 49. He says, before you were knit together in your mother's womb, I called you. Okay. And so for Paul, in the letter to the Galatians, as he goes on to speak about, there's a continuity, there's a difference. He found, in a sense, his deepest bliss in his faith in Jesus. But it was not like something else, you know what I mean? It was in line, it sort of fulfilled everything he longed for as a member of Israel. And this, I think, is also true for Matthew's gospel. It's one of the interesting things that we can think about and talk about on our trip, and something that's being rediscovered today. A lot of it, I think, triggered by John Paul II. Sort of the retrieval of the Jewish heritage of early Christianity. Now, you asked also what was going on that made people receptive to this. Well, this was a turbulent time in Palestinian Judaism. For a century before, they had their own, under their own governance, the Maccabean, the Hasmonean dynasty, but that had sort of worn down into chaos. And there were factions, there was civil war. This is where Herod the Great emerges. The Romans were invited in to arbitrate the civil war. Big mistake, okay? And so the Romans were dominating Palestine, Palestinian Judaism, the area of the gospel arena. And you had very strong factions. You had reform movements like the Pharisees, this lay reform movement, trying to pull Judaism back to its deepest wellsprings. You had people that were, like the Sadducees, compromising with the influence of Greco-Roman culture, and being lured away. So there was a certain amount of chaos, and that may well have said, here's a clear message coming. The other thing I just would mention, there's a book by an author, sociologist named Rodney Stark. And he asked the same question you're asking. Why this rapid expanse of early Christianity? And his answer ultimately is, he says it has more to do with healing than it does with doctrine. Okay? And what he means by that is this, that the Christian community, given the ethos and teaching of Jesus, love one another and so on, was, you read in the early chapters of Acts, they held all things in common. No one was in need. I mean, this is a dynamic communal movement. And healing was a big part of the ministry of Jesus, caring for people. And that, in fact, Stark speculates, there was a lot of epidemics in the first century world because of sanitation and so on, and because of density of population in these cities, very dense. And so if you're a community that cares for your members and has a certain amount of hygiene and gives nourishment and so on, you have a higher survival rate. I mean, you become, look at, that saying, look at these Christians, see how they love each other. And so he feels that a lot of the influx of people into the Christian movement was not simply based on people being persuaded by the preaching, which would be part of it, but also because they wanted to join a community like this that was, a vibrant, living, caring community. And you start to think in the Gospels, which is very interesting, all of the Gentiles that Jesus encounters in the Gospels is all in the context of healing. Okay. The centurion, the Canaanite woman, the Gadarene demoniac, they're coming in because they're being healed. And to me, it's very interesting. You can think abstractly, but then you can think also in terms of human need and, what these communities, what an impression they may have made in the urban setting of the first century. So, a question to think about. I mean, some of these cities, Antioch, Rome itself, the density of population, it rivals Calcutta. People were very close upon each other and, sanitation, sewage, and so on. The Romans worked at that, but it still was pretty primitive. And so that's something to, anyway, I offer that for your reflection. How's everybody doing? Okay? Maybe go 10 minutes more, then we'll take a break, coffee break or so. Yeah, good? Remember, if you fall asleep, just lay your head on the desk, and I'll ask Stephanie to focus in on you to get the back of your head. Okay. Well, let's take a little plunge into. This is on page 2, tracking the narrative of Acts. And let me just get my text here. So the first. Okay, this just mentioned this. I'm going to go to another map of this one. This puts on to the. Here we are. See Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria. Can everybody see that? Here's our, arena where the early chapters of Acts are going to take place. And then they move from Cyprus, and here is Syrian Antioch. See it there? And there is the province of Cilicia with Tarsus, Paul's birthplace. We'll see that Paul, he goes to Tarsus and sort of mopes for a couple of years until Barnabas comes and takes him to Antioch to sort of rehabilitate him. They were afraid of him. So then these other cities are major cities in terms of Paul's letters. So there's Philippi, there are the Philippians. There's Thessaloniki, will be in all these places. Corinth, Athens, Paul stops in Athens, but he doesn't write any letters to it. And here's Ephesus. And then, of course, he'll come back to here. And Galatia, the Galatians, is a region of Asia Minor. And then this map, this shows what we're looking at, and I put the first outbreak of the, I see it's spelled wrong up there, out. We can drop the B and the R need to be reversed. But this is what, here you have Jerusalem, and in these first few chapters of Acts, it describes the Jerusalem community, as we'll see in a moment. Very tight-knit, worshiping in the temple, filled with the Spirit of God, caring for each other, sharing everything in common, no one in need. It's sort of an ideal description of sort of the Christian way. And then it begins to break out, okay? And you have, for example, Philip the deacon is moved by the Spirit, and if you remember the story, he is on the Gaza Road. Think about the Gaza Strip today. And there's an Ethiopian eunuch who's on his way back to Ethiopia from the court of Candace. And he's reading the book of Isaiah. And the Spirit, in sort of this miraculous way, plunks Philip the deacon down next to the carriage. And he says, "What are you reading?" And he says, "Someone has to explain this to me." So Philip gets in the carriage, explains about Isaiah. And the Ethiopian eunuch is moved to want to be baptized. And they pass him water. He says, "What's to stop me from being baptized?" So he's baptized right there and continues on his way. And what's interesting about this is all the way through in these early chapters, things happen by surprise. Okay? There was not a neat pastoral plan. Okay? And what Luke is describing, in effect, is how Christianity got to Africa. And it gets to Africa through an Ethiopian eunuch, that the Jerusalem community had not planned at all about this, but there it is. This is how it happens. And then Philip is taken by the Spirit back to Azotus, and he goes up to Samaria, also preaching. And then we're going to have stories of Peter. Lydda is where the airport is, in Lode Airport. And he goes and he heals a paralyzed man, Aeneas. And then he's called by the Christians to come to Joppa, which is the port city, the ancient port city for Jerusalem, very small port. And that's where Dorcas, the woman who does the beautiful embroideries, has passed away. And the friends of Dorcas call Peter, when they hear he's this close, to come to Joppa. And he comes and he gets everybody out of the room, the people that were wailing, and they were showing him, it's a very touching story, they're showing him the embroideries that Dorcas did. And he clears the room and says, Tabitha, which is the Hebrew word for Dorcas. It's the same name, Tabitha. Tabitha cum, Tabitha arise. And she gets up and, one of these miracles, the raising of the dead. Some of you may remember if you were in West Jerusalem, right on King David Street, there's an old fragment of a Byzantine church sitting right there in front of a department store. I don't know if you saw it. And it has on the words on it, Tabitha cum. It's from the story, Tabitha, Dorcas, rise up. Why it's still there, I have no idea. But anyway, that's a little trivial pursuit for you. So then Joppa is where Peter is going to stay, and I'll go back over this, but he's here in the house of Simon the tanner, and he falls asleep on the roof waiting for lunch. And we just had this reading, where in the daily liturgy, where this big napkin is let down with all the non-kosher foods in it, and a voice from heaven says, "Take and eat." And Peter, who's observant Jew, says, "Lord, I have never eaten anything unclean in all my life." And the voice comes again, says, "You are not to call unclean what I have made clean." And at that, the vision fades, and there's a knock at the door, and it is emissaries from Caesarea, sent by Cornelius, the centurion, the commander of the Roman contingent. Just to confuse things, at the time of Jesus, time of the early church, this was the center of Roman governance, Caesarea Maritima. Roman troops were stationed there, and they would come up to Jerusalem in the area of Judea at times of the festival, but most of the concentration of troops and the residence of the Roman governor of this area of Judea and Samaria was in Caesarea. So the vision fades, and there's a knock at the door. It's the emissaries from Cornelius, and Peter goes to, in chapter 10 of Acts, and this is one of the great turning points of the story. And Cornelius, a Roman centurion, a Gentile, wants to receive baptism. And you have the famous speech of Peter. This is the first dramatic moment in which Gentiles are being received. And he goes through sort of a sermon, or thinking theologically, how is he able to do this? He remembers that Jesus went around doing good to everyone who was in need. And while it says, while Peter is still speaking, the Holy Spirit fell upon Cornelius and his household. He didn't wait for the end of the sermon. And you have some great phrases in here, and this is getting us into the theology of Acts. Peter says, I begin to see that God is impartial, and the person of any nation who fears God and acts uprightly, justly, belongs to God. An extraordinary principle. That God it's acceptable to God. This person is acceptable to God. A person of any nation who fears God and acts uprightly is acceptable to God. And after he baptizes Cornelius and his household, Peter is called back to Jerusalem by the other apostles and put on the spot. So what were you doing, baptizing Greeks, as they call them, Greco-Romans. And he goes through the whole story. He tells his whole story again of being in Joppa and all that's happened. And he has another great one-liner. He says, when the Spirit fell upon them, I said to myself, if they receive the same gift that we have received, who am I to stand in the way of God? So what you have happening in this early section of Acts is the outbreak of early Christianity to the Gentile world, and the acceptance of the Gentiles on equal footing with the Jewish Christians. And this is what, this first great section of Acts, this is what Luke wants to communicate. This is something that Christianity still struggles with. There's a famous article, and we'll take our break right after this, but there's a famous article written by Karl Rahner, who was one of the great theologians at the Second Vatican Council. People know he was a Jesuit. And it was a commencement address he gave at the Jesuit School of Weston, that's now part of Boston College, in 1979. And his question was, what was really happening underneath the Second Vatican Council, the 50th anniversary of which we're celebrating now? And he says one way to look at this, he said, is to remember the periods of church history. And he said it all can be divided into 3 periods. And the first period was the Jewish Christian period. The center was Jerusalem. The language was Hebrew. They worshiped in the temple. Their whole sense of morality and liturgy and everything else was Jewish. And he said that lasted roughly till about 70 AD. Okay. From 30 to 70 AD, the destruction of the temple, the whole disruption that would go on in both Judaism and early Christianity. He says the second period of church history was from 70 till about 1964. And this he calls the Hellenistic period, okay, where Christianity moved into the Greco-Roman world. And even though obviously enormous differences, it was all continuity within Western history. Okay. So Rome becomes the focus. Latin and the European languages become, let's say, Roman law, Roman liturgy, Western perspective, Western philosophy dominating our theology. And he says, finally, we're entering into the third period. This was his vantage point, which he attributed to the tremendous transformations that had happened, particularly after World War II. He said you could reach back maybe to the Enlightenment, and the Renaissance, and the French Revolution, but colonialization ending, and personalism, the awareness of culture, the multiplication of nations, all this tremendous transformation that took place. He said the impact on the church is that for the first time the church is beginning to experience itself as a universal church. Okay? Not simply embedded in Western culture and architecture and liturgy, but suddenly, starting to hear from the various cultures around the world. And that's still going on very intensely, And he concludes, and this is the connection back to Acts, he says that the best analogy to what is happening now in this transition from the dominance of Western culture and thought in Christianity into a more universal, the best analogy is what happened between the first and second periods of church history, when Christianity began to move beyond the borders of Judaism, of Palestinian Judaism, let's say, for lack of a better term, out into the broader Gentile world. That transformation, that incredible crossing of boundaries of culture and custom and religious sensitivity, this was the major concern of the first century. This is the major concern of the New Testament, and certainly the Acts of the Apostles. Some have said, we had Vatican I and Vatican II councils, and they were concerned about sort of reform of the church and so on. That if we have another ecumenical council, it should be called Jerusalem II and not Vatican III, because at Jerusalem, that will come to the council in the center of Acts, was trying to mediate between Jewish Christianity and Gentile Christianity, with Paul and Peter as the antagonists, you remember, or at least representing those. So this is a big part of Luke. What he's showing in this first major section, first 10, 11 chapters of the Acts of the Apostles, was the rootedness of the Christian movement in Jerusalem, the beauty of it, the influence of it, the conception of Israel as this covenant community where people care for each other, the presence in the temple. And then to show from that, moved by the Spirit, and with that as a foundation, it begins to open its arms and embrace a wider world. And the struggles of that and the advances of that is really the story of the Acts of the Apostles. That's what he wants to tell Theophilus. It's sort of say, here's your roots, and then here's what's happened in between. Does that make any sense? it's fascinating that the Acts of the, I mean, I think it's a very, what would you say, contemporary question. Because all along they had to adapt things, and you see, you know, they didn't have a lot of precedents. And I feel we're sort of in that kind of situation today as we're struggling with the culture, we're struggling with issues of morality and authority and structure, and you know, this is the precedent of something like the Acts of the Apostles. They were also in a new frontier, you know, that they had not experienced before. So let's take a little break. When we come back, you may have some questions or comments. Should we take about 10 minutes or so? The bathrooms, in case you haven't, they're down near the elevators.